はい、皆さん、こんにちは。米国特許セミナーパテントターミノロジーです。このシリーズでは、特許用語、表現などをできるだけわかりやすく解説しています。講師は、米国特許弁護士であるブライアン・エピスタインさんです。今回は、英文特許クレームにおける要素の単数形と複数形について見ていきたいと思います。では、早速ご解説いただきます。Okay, Brian さん、please share your thoughts on singular and plural elements.
Sure. So this series is nominally directed towards Japanese to English translation. And as many of our viewers know, the Japanese language can be a little ambiguous regarding singular and plural nouns. And so, not every noun gets paired with tachi to let you know it's plural. However, American claim construction requires precise enumeration of claim elements, at least with regards to, having more than one of something. And therefore, Japanese to English translation can create many issues in this regard.
はい。はい。ここまでまとめますと、日本語は、名詞の単数形と複数形が曖昧である一方、アメリカでは単数形か複数形かを明確に記載することが求められるということでした。はい。で、ここで、翻訳に関して、ここでちょっと問題が起こりうるということでした。Okay, next please.
Sure. So, what are some of the potential issues that might come up? Well, a claim that requires at least two of an element, for example, a plurality of arms, does not necessarily cover a competitor's device only having one of the element. For example, or that is one arm. And the reason is that there's no literal infringement of the claim, right? If the competitor's device only has one arm, they don't have a plurality of arms. And so there's a missing element precluding infringement of this claim. But even before we reach litigation, this type of issue can arise in prosecution as well, right? During prosecution, a plurality of arms might not receive patentable weight. An arm will receive weight, but the fact that there's a plurality is often overlooked by, or can be overlooked by, examiners under the broadest reasonable interpretation, because the examiner can insist that it's a mere duplication of parts, right? If the prior art has one arm and you're claiming a plurality of arms, that's just duplicating the number of arms. And they've got this MPEP section to rely on. And so between the issue of enforcing this type of claim, as well as the fact that this type of element might not be given patentable weight during prosecution, we generally want to claim the fewest elements for which the combination of elements in the claim properly functions.
はい、ここまでまとめますと、ある要素が複数あることを、クレームした場合、それは、要素が一つしかない場合をカバーしないということでした。さらに、プロセキューションにおいて、a plurality of で表現されるような、複数の要素には特許的ウェイトが認められない可能性があるということでした。はい。では次に行きたいと思います。Next slide, please.
Sure. So let's go through an example as to how this might arise during prosecution. So we'll begin with kind of an explanation of an invention that we might receive in an invention disclosure form. So conventionally, in the prior art, a system includes a server that transmits instructions to a client device. And then to reduce delay, our inventive novel system includes a plurality of client devices. And in a particular embodiment, the server transmits instructions to a client device with less delay, right? For example, less network latency. And so, we can have a faster transmission to a client device than the prior art has, where maybe the only client device has some sort of network traffic preventing the rapid transmission of this instruction. All right, so what kind of claiming strategy might we have? So this is not recommended. Let me be clear. But this is the thought process that a lot of at least American patent attorneys and possibly some Ben-Rishi go through. So claim 1 will be a system comprising a plurality of client devices. And they'll take this view because the structure of the system differs from the prior art by including this plurality of client devices, right? That is from this particular view, that is the point of novelty, right? There's more than one, and so one of them will might receive the information faster than another. Claim 2 might depend from claim 1 and recite that the system determines the latency to one of the plurality of client devices. And claim 3 then depends from claim 2. And now the system transmits instructions to the one of the plurality of devices. Again, why might a drafter do this? Maybe the claim drafter envisions that the bases for selecting one of the plurality of client devices is something other than latency, right? And this is common. An inventor tells us something and we say, okay, you want it to be latency, but, I'm familiar enough with the art to know that geographical proximity, how close you physically are to something, has a relationship to how quickly an instruction can be transmitted. And it's less transient than latency, right? Tokyo is always a certain distance from Osaka. But the network traffic between the two might change a lot. And so, maybe it's better to base the system on geographical proximity than network latency. And so that's kind of the strategy that this kind of claim drafter might take. But let's look at why this isn't a good practice. So on this slide, we're showing, we're actually writing it as a claim as opposed to, pseudo claims. And at the top, you can see the kind of independent claim that gets produced. It says a system comprising a plurality of client devices and a server configured to transmit instructions, and so on. What I'm suggesting is that the inventive step is not in the number of client devices, right? The idea is that by having the plurality of client devices, we're just duplicating the client device in the prior art. And instead, the inventive step is in additionally configuring the server to determine the latency. Okay, and so that's this claim towards the bottom where it says a system comprising a client device and a server configured to determine a latency to the client device and to transmit instructions, probably to the client device. And so that's what the significance of having these different client devices is. Okay. On the previous slide, though, I talked about geographical proximity. So, why am I suddenly taking that out of this claim? In that case, we'll want to add support to our specification to describe that, which is not something that was in the invention disclosure form that I kind of suggested we had here. This is the sort of role that patent attorneys should be taking. I literally did that this morning. And then once we have that added to the specification, we can generalize the operation, right? So instead of saying, determine a latency, maybe we say determine a network attribute and transmit instructions based on the network attribute. And so that's what I'm trying to suggest here is that you're never going to distinguish, not never, you're unlikely to distinguish over the prior art based solely on the inclusion of additional client devices. And instead, we want to look at how these additional client devices impact the performance of the system. And that is by the server determining a latency to probably all, but at least one of the client devices, and then transmitting instructions based on that.
はい。ここまでは、実際のクレームの例を見てきました。サーバーとクライアント装置を含むシステムにおいて、信号の送信、遅延を回避する目的で、クライアント装置が複数設けられているというクレームでした。そして、このクレームをリバイズして、複数のクライアント装置を一つのクライアント装置に書き直して、その上で、サーバーに遅延回避に関する特徴を加えるという例も紹介されました。はい、では次に行きたいと思います。Okay, Brian さん、next slide, please.
All right, so far we've been discussing claims using the transitional phrase comprising. What about consisting of? So the use of close-ended transitions like consisting of sometimes can create unintended effects. And the reason is that for comprising, the word a generally means one or more. But for the phrase consisting of, based on some court cases, the word a is more likely to mean only one than in the case of comprising, right? It's not just comprising a client device. It's more like, consisting of only one client device. So there's this additional concern that when we're, enumerating Marcouche groups, for example, in a close-ended, with a close-ended transitional phrase, like consisting of, the word a there means only one of those. Of course, that's not always the case. This consideration is based on the specification, but it's an issue to be aware of. And so, if you're drafting this kind of application, if it's a chemical application, and so it's, more likely to use some sort of close-ended transitional phrase, then you want to be careful with your specification, and you'll want to be careful with your claim language, and be aware that although there are cases where comprising a client device means only one, those are generally not the case. But for consisting of, you're more likely to run into an interpretation where a means only one.
はい、このスライドでは、クレームの移行部で使う表現について解説いただきました。consisting of という表現には、注意が必要で、これは comprising という、一般的な、オープンエンドな表現よりも only one の意味合いが強いということでした。はい、次に行きたいと思います。Next slide, please.
Sure. So what can practitioners do? Well, we want to draft claims towards the minimal number of elements. And this isn't anything particular to Japanese practitioners or to Nihongo itself. Practitioners worldwide struggle with this. I see a lot of American and European practitioners that originally draft their claims and specification in English struggle with this issue as well. So everybody needs to focus on drafting claims with minimal elements. When we do have a plurality of elements, we want to focus on why there are multiples of those elements. So for example, does the server transmit instructions to one of the plurality of client devices, right? It's not just that there are the plurality, it's that it's transmitting instructions to one of them. And then maybe we can take a second step and say, okay, it's not just one, but it's a particular one that that has a lower network latency or has a favorable network attribute or has a closer geographical proximity, whatever it is. Because that's the step, that's the operation that's not shown in the prior art. And you can still do that with just one of the element, right? You can check the network latency and then send the to the element to the one client device, and then send the instruction to the one. That would still infringe this claim. All right, so that's what practitioners can do. What about translators? So here, translators can bring the ambiguity of certain phrases to the attention of the client, right? You can say, I can't tell if you want one or more than one. There's not a lot to do with the comprising or consisting of. That's just going to be dictated by the way that the claims are drafted. But another tip is to use terms like a plurality of client devices or plural client devices. But we want to stick with those terms. We don't want to get creative here. And what I mean by that is we want to avoid creative terms like a multiplicity of client devices. And the reason is that in English, a phrase like multiplicity of client devices sounds like it's more than two. I mean, I wouldn't really be able to give you a number of how many that is. I'm probably thinking it's more like 3 or 4 of something. But, it's an ambiguous number, and it definitely sounds more like a plurality of, because a plurality of is easily satisfied by just 2, but a multiplicity sounds like, although it could be 2, there's a connotation that it's more than 2. And so we don't want to go down that path. We want to stick to plural or a plurality of.
はい、ここまでは、実務家へのアドバイスと翻訳者へのアドバイスについてでした。実務家へのアドバイスは、最小限の要素でクレームをドラフトすることと、そして、なぜ要素が複数必要かをよく考えるということでした。翻訳者へのアドバイスは、単数形と複数形について曖昧な部分があれば、それについて依頼主と相談してみるということで。また、multiplicity of という表現は、2よりも多いというニュアンスがあるため、注意が必要だということでした。はい、今回はこれで以上になります。ご質問や扱ってほしいトピックなどがありましたら、YouTube のコメント欄に書いていただくか、スライド最後に記載のメールアドレスまでお気軽にご連絡ください。では本日もありがとうございました。失礼します。